Alyssa Dawson seemed to have it all. In her late 20s, she was a striking African-American woman with a grace that captivated anyone who met her. Her long, flowing curls framed high cheekbones, and her deep brown eyes radiated warmth and mystery. A degree in fine arts from a prestigious university, and her talent for painting had won her a modest following, but it was her marriage to Jamal Dawson that completed the picture of a life many envied. Jamal, an African-American man in his early 30s, was the ideal husband in the eyes of their friends and neighbors. Tall, with a lean, muscular frame and a sharp sense of style, Jamal worked hard at his job as a senior marketing executive at Crawford and Hines, one of the leading corporate firms in their city. His diligence and determination to rise through the ranks were clear, but as time passed, his passion for work eclipsed everything else in his life, including his relationship with Alyssa. Their marriage, once filled with laughter and late-night conversations, had grown cold. Jamal worked long hours, often leaving before dawn and returning well after midnight. The affection between them, once easy and abundant, was now reduced to brief exchanges in the mornings or fleeting glances before falling asleep. Alyssa missed him desperately but found herself alone, both emotionally and physically. It was during one of these lonely periods that she met Darnell. Darnell Porter was Jamal's boss, an African-American man in his early 40s, distinguished, charismatic, and powerful. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches, with broad shoulders and a chiseled jawline that hinted at his once athletic past, he commanded attention the moment he entered a room. While many feared him for his unrelenting nature in the boardroom, others admired him for his business acumen. But it was the subtle charm in his eyes, the confidence with which he moved, that made him impossible to ignore. And when Alyssa first met him at one of the company's social events, she felt an instant, undeniable pull. The evening was filled with chatter, drinks, and formalities, but Alyssa couldn't help noticing how Darnell's gaze lingered on her from across the room. There was something electric in the air, something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being seen. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just Jamal's wife, the artist, or the homemaker. She was a woman, desired and noticed by someone powerful. As the night went on, Darnell approached her under the pretense of polite conversation. "I've heard about your work," he said smoothly, his voice deep and velvety. "Your paintings are remarkable." Alyssa felt a flush of warmth creep up her neck as she met his gaze. "Thank you," she replied, slightly taken aback. "I didn't think anyone in the firm knew about that." "I make it a point to learn about the people around me," Darnell said, his eyes never leaving hers, "especially when they're as talented as you." There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to hint at something unsaid. Alyssa's heart raced, and she struggled to maintain composure, though the way he looked at her sent shivers down her spine. Over the next few weeks, Darnell and Alyssa's paths crossed more frequently, usually in fleeting moments at company events or in casual emails Jamal never knew about. Their conversations became increasingly personal, peppered with teasing flirtation that both thrilled and terrified her. It wasn't long before Darnell suggested they meet outside of these accidental run-ins. It started innocently, a coffee downtown to discuss art, a private invitation to a gallery opening where she found herself laughing more than she had in months. But the tension between them was palpable, and with each meeting, the barrier between professional courtesy and forbidden attraction grew thinner. One rainy afternoon, Alyssa found herself at a hotel bar with Darnell after a long conversation about life, art, and their mutual dissatisfaction with their current situations. She had only intended to meet him for a drink, but as the rain poured outside, trapping them in the warm, intimate atmosphere of the bar, her resolve began to waver. "I don't think I've felt this alive in a long time," Darnell confessed, his fingers brushing hers lightly as they sat side by side. "I can't stop thinking about you, Alyssa." His words hit her like a bolt of lightning. She knew it was wrong, knew that she was betraying her husband just by being here. But the loneliness she had felt for so long clouded her judgment. She looked into Darnell's eyes, filled with longing and a promise of something she had been missing for years. Without a word, Darnell stood and offered his hand. Trembling, Alyssa hesitated for only a moment before taking it, allowing herself to be led upstairs to a private suite. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the curtains. As the door closed behind them, Darnell pressed Alyssa against the wall, his hands exploring her body with a hunger that made her gasp. Their kisses were urgent, their touch feverish as clothes were discarded in a blur of passion. She felt herself melting into him, the weight of guilt momentarily washed away by the intensity of their desire. The bed was soft beneath them as they tangled together, bodies moving in rhythm, each touch sending shockwaves through her. Darnell's hands roamed her curves with expertise, his lips tracing a path down her neck and across her chest. Alyssa's moans filled the room as they became lost in each other, the line between right and wrong dissolving in the heat of the moment. When it was over, they lay in silence, the sound of their heavy breathing the only thing filling the space between them. But as reality set in, so did the guilt. Alyssa pulled away, covering herself with the sheet as the weight of what they had just done came crashing down. I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm married, Darnell." He reached for her, his hand brushing her arm gently. "I know," he said quietly, "but you can't deny that this feels right, that we feel right." Alyssa closed her eyes, torn between the truth in his words and the loyalty she still felt toward Jamal. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Alyssa's affair with Darnell continued in secret over the next several months. Their meetings became more frequent, their passion more intense, but the guilt gnawed at her. Each time she returned home to Jamal, she felt a heavy weight settle on her chest. She still loved her husband, but the distance between them had grown too wide to bridge. And now there was something else, something that made the situation infinitely more complicated. Alyssa was pregnant. The realization hit her like a freight train one morning when she missed her period for the second month in a row. She had taken a pregnancy test in the privacy of their bathroom, her hands shaking as she waited for the result. When the 2 pink lines appeared, she sank to the floor in disbelief. Who was the father? Could it be Jamal from the rare moments they had been together? Or was it Darnell's? The uncertainty consumed her, and the knowledge that she had to make a choice, one that would alter her life forever, left her paralyzed. She avoided Darnell for days, not knowing how to tell him the truth. But when they finally met again in his office late one evening, she could no longer keep it to herself. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Darnell's eyes widened, and for the first time since they had begun their affair, Alyssa saw a flicker of fear across his face. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice tight. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know who the father is, Darnell. It could be you, or it could be Jamal." There was a long, tense silence before Darnell finally spoke. "We'll figure this out," he said, though his tone lacked the confidence it usually held. "Whatever happens, I'll be there for you." But Alyssa knew it wasn't that simple. Jamal had no idea about the affair, and the thought of him finding out, of the life they had built together crumbling around them, was unbearable. The pregnancy brought with it an air of suspicion. Jamal, who had been too focused on work to notice the subtle changes in his wife's behavior before, now became more attentive. He sensed something was off but couldn't put his finger on it. "You've been distant lately," Jamal said one night as they sat at the dinner table. "Is everything okay?" Alyssa forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've just been tired, that's all. There's a lot on my mind." Jamal reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and familiar. "You know you can talk to me, right? I'm here for you, no matter what." The sincerity in his voice made Alyssa's stomach churn with guilt. How could she tell him the truth? How could she admit that she had betrayed him in the worst possible way? But as the weeks passed, Jamal's suspicion grew. He noticed the way Alyssa's mood shifted, her frequent absences, and the long silences between them. He began asking more probing questions, and each time Alyssa would deflect or give half-hearted excuses. Jamal wasn't a fool. He could sense something was wrong, but he didn't yet know the extent of the betrayal. The tension in their home became unbearable. Alyssa's nerves were frayed, not just from the fear of Jamal discovering the affair, but from the uncertainty of her pregnancy. She hadn't yet gone to the doctor for an ultrasound, too terrified to face the truth about the baby's paternity. The pressure weighed heavily on her, and she often found herself retreating into silence, avoiding both men. Darnell, on the other hand, had grown more possessive. While he initially maintained his composed demeanor, The knowledge of Alyssa's pregnancy had unleashed a side of him she hadn't seen before. He began calling her more frequently, showing up unexpectedly at places she didn't expect him to, and expressing thinly veiled jealousy whenever she mentioned her time with Jamal. "I don't want to share you with him anymore," Darnell said one night after their clandestine meeting at a luxury apartment he rented for their tryst. His tone was low, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. "You need to make a decision, Alyssa." The ultimatum hung between them like a dark cloud, suffocating her. "What do you expect me to do, Darnell?" she shot back, her frustration finally bubbling over. "I'm pregnant, and I don't even know if the child is yours. I can't just walk away from my husband." Darnell's face hardened, and for the first time, Alyssa saw a coldness in him that sent a shiver down her spine. "You've already made your choice the moment you let this happen. Do you really think Jamal would want to stay with you after finding out the truth?" His words hit her like a punch in the gut, and though she hated to admit it, he wasn't wrong. Jamal, the loving, devoted husband who had sacrificed so much for their future, would be devastated if he learned about the affair, especially if the baby wasn't his. Alyssa felt trapped. There was no way out of this situation that wouldn't destroy her life, no path that wouldn't leave someone she cared about shattered. As Alyssa's pregnancy progressed, so did the cracks in her carefully constructed world. Jamal became more suspicious with each passing day, especially after noticing that Alyssa was avoiding any intimate contact with him. At first, he thought it was just stress, maybe even something related to her work, but then he started to pick up on the smallest things. The subtle hints of new perfumes, late-night text notifications that she quickly dismissed, the distant, vacant look in her eyes whenever he tried to connect with her. The breaking point came when he found a set of hotel receipts in Alyssa's handbag. The receipts were from upscale hotels, places far beyond what Alyssa would normally visit alone, and the dates matched the nights she had claimed to be visiting friends or working on her art. Jamal's blood ran cold as he held the receipts in his hands, his heart pounding with the realization that something was terribly wrong. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jamal began following Alyssa. One night, after claiming she had a late art class, he trailed her from a distance, his car blending in with the heavy traffic. He watched in disbelief as she pulled into the parking lot of an upscale apartment building on the other side of town. His stomach twisted as he saw her enter without hesitation, her face tense but determined. An hour passed before she emerged, but she wasn't alone. Darnell walked beside her, his hand resting casually on the small of her back as they made their way toward his car. Jamal felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces at the sight. His boss, his mentor, the man who had helped him rise through the ranks of his company, was the one Alyssa had been sneaking around with. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His world was spinning out of control. Jamal followed them at a distance, watching as Darnell dropped Alyssa off at home and drove away. His hands clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white with fury. Jamal waited until Darnell was gone before stepping out of his car and entering his home, where Alyssa had already retreated to their bedroom. The air was thick with tension as he entered the room, his mind racing with what he had just witnessed. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice calm, but laced with an underlying edge. Alyssa looked up, startled by the sudden question. "I told you I had a late class," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. Jamal's eyes darkened, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out the hotel receipts. "You want to try again?" Alyssa's face went pale as she stared at the papers in his hand, the weight of the truth crashing down around her. For a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't even think. She had known this day would come, but now that it was here, she had no idea how to handle it. "Jamal, I can explain," she stammered, but the words felt hollow even as they left her lips. "Explain?" Jamal's voice rose, the calm mask slipping as the betrayal and anger he had been holding in finally erupted. "Explain what, Alyssa? That you've been sneaking around behind my back? That you've been sleeping with my boss?" Tears welled up in Alyssa's eyes as she tried to find the right words, but there were none that could make this better. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "It just happened, and You never wanted to hurt me?" Jamal interrupted, his voice filled with disbelief. "You've destroyed me, Alyssa. You've destroyed us." Alyssa broke down in sobs, collapsing onto the bed as the full weight of her actions hit her. "I'm sorry," she cried. I'm so sorry. Jamal's hands clenched into fists as he stood over her, the anger coursing through him like a tidal wave. He wanted to scream, to hit something, to make the pain stop, but all he could do was stare at the woman he had loved more than anything in the world, the woman who had torn his life apart. Days passed, and the house was thick with silence. Jamal and Alyssa barely spoke, each retreating into their own world of guilt, anger, and sorrow. Jamal slept on the couch, unable to look at her, let alone share a bed with her. Alyssa tried to reach out to him, to explain herself, but he was cold and distant, shutting her out completely. Meanwhile, Darnell's presence loomed large in their lives. Jamal was forced to see him every day at work, the man he had once respected, now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life. Every meeting, every casual conversation felt like a lie, and Jamal could barely contain his rage. One evening, Jamal received a call from Darnell, something that hadn't happened since he'd discovered the affair. Jamal's first instinct was to hang up, but something in Darnell's tone made him pause. "We need to talk," Darnell said, his voice low and serious. "About what?" Jamal replied, barely able to hide his contempt. "About Alyssa and the baby." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. "The baby?" His mind raced. Alyssa hadn't mentioned anything about the pregnancy to him, and the sudden revelation sent his emotions spiraling. He knew what this meant. If the baby was Darnell's, the betrayal was even deeper than he had imagined. "Yes," Darnell said, his voice steady. "She's pregnant, and we need to figure out how to handle this." Jamal's blood boiled. The audacity of Darnell, his boss, the man who had slept with his wife, speaking about this situation as though it were something they could calmly handle. He felt the walls closing in on him, his rage simmering just beneath the surface. "We're not handling anything," Jamal said through gritted teeth. "You've taken everything from me." Darnell remained calm, almost too calm. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can come to an arrangement." "An arrangement?" Jamal's voice was shaking now. "You think you can just throw money at this and make it go away?" Darnell was silent for a moment before speaking again. "I don't want this to get messy, Jamal, but if you push me, I will protect what's mine." The threat was clear, though subtle, and Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. He ended the call without another word, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, of getting even with the man who had ruined his life. As the weeks passed, the tension between Jamal, Alyssa, and Darnell reached a boiling point. Alyssa could feel the danger closing in, but she was too exhausted to fight it anymore. She was nearly 6 months pregnant, and the stress of the situation had taken a toll on her both physically and emotionally. Jamal, meanwhile, was slipping into a dark place. He began drinking heavily, drowning the pain of betrayal in bottle after bottle of whiskey. His thoughts became darker, consumed by a storm of rage and despair. He replayed Darnell's words in his mind over and over. "I will protect what's mine." Each time it drove him further into a spiral of resentment. Alyssa noticed the changes in him. The man who once radiated warmth and kindness had turned into a cold, distant stranger. She wanted to reach out, to apologize again, to beg for his forgiveness, but she knew it was too late. She had already shattered the life they once had. The baby growing inside her only made it worse, a constant reminder of the affair, a living testament to her betrayal. She feared what Jamal might do once the truth came out, and her guilt left her paralyzed. Darnell, on the other hand, was growing bolder. He began pressing Alyssa for more, calling her constantly, urging her to leave Jamal and come live with him. "You can't keep pretending this marriage works," he told her over the phone one night. "The sooner you walk away, the better it will be for all of us." But Alyssa couldn't walk away. Despite everything, a part of her still loved Jamal. She loved the life they had built together, even if it was falling apart. And the idea of leaving him, abandoning him while he was in so much pain, felt impossible. One fateful evening, Jamal returned home late from work, his mind clouded by alcohol and anger. Alyssa was in the kitchen, quietly preparing dinner, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But the tension in the house was suffocating. As Jamal entered the kitchen, the air crackled with unspoken words. "We need to talk," Jamal said, his voice gruff and unsteady. Alyssa froze, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. "What about?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer. The baby, Jamal replied, his eyes narrowing. Is it mine? Alyssa felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had dreaded this moment for months, hoping it wouldn't come, but now she had no choice but to face it. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It could be yours, or it could be Darnell's. Jamal's face contorted in a mixture of rage and despair. He slammed his fist onto the countertop, the sound reverberating through the kitchen. You don't know? He spat. How could you not know, Alyssa? You betrayed me, and now you're pregnant with God knows whose child. Tears streamed down Alyssa's face as she tried to explain, but the words caught in her throat. I'm sorry, Jamal. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Jamal's eyes were wild, his fists clenched at his sides. Sorry? He shouted. Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't make up for you sleeping with my boss. Do you even realize what you've done to me? To us? Alyssa sobbed, unable to find any words that would soothe the storm brewing inside her husband. She reached out, but Jamal pushed her hand away, his face contorted in anger. You disgust me, he said coldly, turning away from her. I can't even look at you. The next morning, Jamal woke up with a pounding headache, the remnants of his anger and alcohol still clouding his judgment. But one thing was clear, he couldn't continue like this. He needed to confront Darnell. The thought of his boss walking around freely, untouched by the pain he had caused, infuriated him. Jamal made up his mind. He grabbed his keys and drove to Darnell's apartment, his hands shaking as he clutched the steering wheel. The anger that had been simmering inside him for weeks was now a boiling cauldron, and he was ready to explode. When he arrived at Darnell's building, Jamal stormed inside, ignoring the concierge's questions as he made his way to the penthouse. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the door and pounded on it with his fist. Moments later, Darnell opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to caution as he saw the fury in Jamal's eyes. We need to talk, Jamal growled, his voice barely contained. Darnell's demeanor remained calm, though Jamal could see the tension in his jaw. Jamal, I don't think this is the place for… You ruined my life, Jamal shouted, cutting him off. You took everything from me, my wife, my marriage. And now what? You think you're going to raise my child? Is that what this is? Darnell stepped aside, gesturing for Jamal to enter. Let's talk inside. We can handle this like men. Jamal stormed in, pacing the room like a caged animal. Like men? You think this can be handled like men after what you did? I didn't force Alyssa into anything, Darnell said, his voice steady but firm. She came to me. She made her own choices, and now we have to deal with the consequences. Jamal clenched his fists, feeling his anger bubble over. You manipulated her. You knew what you were doing, Darnell. Don't act like you're innocent in all this. Darnell raised an eyebrow. I never claimed to be innocent. But let's not pretend Alyssa wasn't looking for something that you weren't giving her. The words hit Jamal like a slap to the face. He lunged at Darnell, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Don't you dare talk about her like that, Jamal shouted, his face inches from Darnell's. But Darnell didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, almost condescending. You think violence is going to fix this, Jamal? You think hitting me is going to make her love you again? Jamal froze, his grip loosening as the weight of Darnell's words sank in. He had spent so long being consumed by anger that he hadn't considered the truth. Nothing he did would change what had already happened. Slowly, he released Darnell and stepped back, breathing heavily. I don't want to fix this, he said, his voice low. I want you to pay. Darnell straightened his collar, watching Jamal with a wary expression. And how exactly do you plan to make me pay, Jamal? I have more power, more money, and more influence than you could ever dream of. You can't touch me. But Jamal's eyes were filled with a new resolve. Don't be so sure. That night, Jamal returned home, his mind racing with dark thoughts. The confrontation with Darnell had only solidified one thing. There was no way to repair what had been broken. He couldn't stand the thought of living in the same world as Darnell, a man who had taken everything from him and felt no remorse. As the days passed, Jamal became more withdrawn. Alyssa tried to reach out, but every attempt was met with cold indifference. He watched her carefully, waiting for the right moment to set his plan in motion. One evening, after weeks of silence, Jamal approached Alyssa as she sat on the couch, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She looked up at him, surprised to see him standing there, a strange look in his eyes. "I've been thinking," Jamal said softly, his voice eerily calm. "Maybe we should start over, put the past behind us and move forward." Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a chance for redemption. "Do you mean that?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. Jamal nodded. "I've been angry, but I've realized that I don't want to lose you. We can raise this baby together, no matter who the father is." Tears welled up in Alyssa's eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. "I want that too," she whispered. "I've missed you so much, Jamal." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, almost tender. "Let's take a trip," he suggested. "Just the two of us. We can get away from all of this and start fresh." Alyssa smiled, her heart swelling with relief. "That sounds perfect." A week later, they were driving down a deserted highway late at night. Jamal had insisted they take a scenic route through the countryside, away from the city and all its memories. Alyssa had agreed, excited about the prospect of a fresh start, but as the hours passed, a sense of unease began to settle over her. Jamal was quiet, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his expression unreadable. The darkness outside seemed to stretch on forever, and the further they drove, the more isolated they became. "Where are we going?" Alyssa asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Jamal didn't answer at first. He kept driving, the silence thick between them. Finally he spoke, his voice chillingly calm. "We're almost there, just a little farther." Alyssa's heart started to race as she stared out into the inky darkness beyond the windshield. The isolation felt suffocating. An gnawing sense of dread crept up her spine. She turned to look at Jamal, noticing how his hands gripped the steering wheel with a strange intensity, knuckles pale in the dim light. "Jamal," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady, "where exactly are we going?" There was a beat of silence before he answered, his tone cold and distant. "I just need some closure, Alyssa. We both do." The unease morphed into full-blown fear. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Alyssa's instinct screamed at her to ask more, but the heavy weight in her chest kept her silent. She was too afraid of what his answer might be. After another 10 minutes, the car slowed down, pulling off the main road onto a dirt path leading into the woods. Trees loomed like shadows, their thick branches blotting out the moonlight. Alyssa's breath quickened as the car came to a stop at a small clearing. Jamal turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead, his breathing deep and controlled. Alyssa could hear the rush of her own heartbeat in her ears. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jamal turned to her, his eyes dark, devoid of the warmth they once held. "This is where it ends." Alyssa's pulse spiked, fear gripping her as she fumbled to unbuckle her seatbelt. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" Jamal's face remained expressionless as he opened the car door and stepped out, walking around to her side. Alyssa's hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for the door handle, trying to get out of the car. But before she could escape, Jamal yanked the door open and grabbed her arm, pulling her out with a force she hadn't expected. "No more lies, Alyssa," Jamal said through gritted teeth, his grip tightening on her wrist. "No more running. This ends tonight." Alyssa gasped, struggling to free herself from his hold, but Jamal's grip was too strong. "Jamal, please, don't do this," she cried, her voice desperate. "We can work this out, I swear. Please." Jamal's eyes narrowed as he dragged her deeper into the woods, the moonlight barely illuminating the twisted path ahead. Alyssa stumbled behind him, her body trembling in terror. She had never seen him like this before. This cold, this detached, this dangerous. "Work this out," Jamal scoffed, his voice filled with bitter rage. "You slept with him, Alyssa. You had an affair with the man who's been in my life for years. And now you're carrying his child. Do you really think there's anything left to work out?" Tears streamed down Alyssa's face as she struggled to keep up with him. Her stomach churned with fear and guilt, the weight of her betrayal crushing her. I'm so sorry, Jamal. I never wanted any of this to happen. Please, just let me go." But Jamal wasn't listening. His face was set in stone, his mind already made up. They reached a small clearing, a patch of moonlight breaking through the dense canopy of trees. Jamal stopped, releasing her arm, and stood there, staring down at the ground. Alyssa, breathless and shaking, backed away slowly, her eyes darting around for any possible escape route. "Jamal, please," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "We can still fix this." He turned to face her, and in that moment, Alyssa saw the depth of his pain, the raw, unrelenting hurt that had driven him to this point. But beneath that pain, there was something darker, something that terrified her beyond words. "This was never going to end any other way," Jamal said softly, his voice eerily calm. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun, its metallic surface glinting in the moonlight. Alyssa's heart stopped. She took a step back, her hands instinctively flying to her stomach. "No, Jamal, no, please don't do this." Jamal raised the gun, his hands steady, his face impassive. "I loved you, Alyssa. I would have given you everything, but you made your choice." Alyssa's vision blurred with tears, her mind racing as she desperately searched for something, anything to say that would change his mind. "Think about the baby, Jamal. Even if you hate me, don't do this to our child." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. The gun wavered slightly in his hand. Alyssa held her breath, praying that he would come to his senses, that he would remember the man he used to be. But the moment passed, and the cold, hard resolve returned to his face. "I don't even know if that's my child." Alyssa's knees buckled and she collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please," she whispered, her voice broken. "Please, don't kill me." Jamal's hand trembled as he stared down at her, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop, the air heavy with the tension of what was about to happen. Then out of nowhere, a voice cut through the silence. "Drop the gun, Jamal." Both Jamal and Alyssa froze, turning toward the sound. Emerging from the shadows was Darnell, his eyes locked on Jamal, his own gun drawn and pointed directly at him. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jamal demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "I knew something wasn't right," Darnell replied, his voice steady. "Alyssa didn't show up for our meeting, and I tracked her phone. I'm not letting you take her from me." Alyssa stared at Darnell in shock, her heart pounding. How had he found them? And what did he mean, our meeting? Had Darnell been planning to take her away tonight? Jamal's eyes blazed with hatred as he leveled his gun at Darnell. You ruined everything. You think you can just walk in here and act like the hero?" Darnell didn't flinch. "It's over, Jamal. Put the gun down before you do something you can't take back." But Jamal was beyond reason. The fury inside him erupted as he aimed his gun at Darnell and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees. Alyssa screamed as Darnell staggered back, clutching his chest. Blood blossomed across his shirt as he collapsed to the ground. Jamal stared at Darnell's motionless body, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. He had killed the man who had taken everything from him. But as the reality of what he had done set in, Jamal's hands began to shake uncontrollably. He turned toward Alyssa, who was still on the ground, sobbing in terror. He took a step toward her, but something in her eyes, something filled with pure, unfiltered fear, stopped him in his tracks. Jamal dropped the gun, his body trembling as the weight of his actions crushed him. He sank to his knees, staring down at his hands, now stained with blood. Not just Darnell's, but the blood of the life he had once known, the life he had destroyed. Alyssa managed to crawl over to where Darnell lay, her hands shaking as she reached for his pulse. It was weak, but it was there. She pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "I need help," she sobbed into the phone. "There's been a shooting. Please send someone, please." Jamal sat in silence, his eyes vacant, his mind a blur. The sound of sirens filled the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Alyssa stayed by Darnell's side, tears streaming down her face as she prayed for him to hold on, for this nightmare to end. When the police arrived, they found Jamal sitting motionless in the clearing, the gun lying at his feet. He didn't resist as they cuffed him, his body limp and unresponsive. There was nothing left to fight for. As the ambulance whisked Darnell away and the officers escorted Jamal to the police car, Alyssa stood alone in the clearing, her body shaking with sobs. The life she had once known was gone, shattered by the choices she had made. She was left with nothing but the echoes of the past and the life growing inside her. a life born of betrayal, guilt, and tragedy. And as she stood there, under the cold light of the moon, she realized that no matter what happened next, she would never escape the shadows of her choices. They would haunt her for the rest of her days.